Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. I can't just tell you how tickled I am that my theme song is made like with banjos. That's fantastic. So we have next is Derek Ellington. He is the quote scary white collar crime guy. You don't want him touching your phones. And please delete my browser history if anything happens. Okay. Please welcome Derek Ellington.
Hi. Well, everybody, welcome to Skeptrack. It's great to be back here at DragonCon with you guys, and I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. I'm Derek Ellington. I'm a digital forensics examiner. I've been with you guys in the past, and we've talked about lots of really cool technology stuff. And I got a lot I want to throw at you today, so I'm going to jump right in. And our topic, investigating the millennial mind. And I'm glad to see so many people here today in kind of a recognition of sort of the importance of this. In my career in digital forensics, spanning 20 plus years in digital forensics and IT, I've been involved in lots of investigations that involve young people, either as a suspect, witness, or victim, and began to understand the concerns and the challenges when dealing with investigations with this new generation, like I said, what we're going to call the millennials, but we'll define that better in a little bit. And it became sort of a kind of a mission and a soapbox for me to understand the challenges better. It also had a personal twist because my mother, Roxanne, spent the last 30 years with Duke University as an adolescent addiction specialist. And during the end of her career, she started seeing a recognition of technology addiction and how the young people today's use of technology and growing up and immersed in technology has changed not only the way they communicate with the world, but the way they perceive the world. And so I've also had the opportunity to talk on several occasions with her, us giving joint presentations on this subject. So the presentation that I'm going to do for you today is going to be a kind of a DragonCon edition of investigating the millennial mind speech that I give to a lot of investigators, police, government, fraud investigators, but also to attorneys and counselors and guardians and things like that. And what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at, like we said, the embracing technology, but I think to understand where we got to of this always-on persistence technology and its impact on us, is we're going to take a look at sort of the world of the last 35 years. So before we get started, I will give everybody my standard disclaimer in that we might talk about legal stuff, but I am not an attorney, so anything that we talk about legally, your mileage may vary, and this is also just my favorite cartoon, so I always try to work it in when we can. So if we're talking about millennials, and millennials tend to get a bad rap now. They've ruined the housing market. They've, the colleges aren't going to be able to be around because they won't pay their student loans. I think recently I heard that Applebee's is in trouble because millennials won't eat at Applebee's. And the one from about a week or two ago, I don't know if you saw it going around, but apparently there was a concern that millennials were ruining mayonnaise. That millennials do not eat mayonnaise anymore. And I'm going to tell you, I'm a born and bred Southern boy. Mayonnaise is going to be okay. Mayonnaise will be fine. We're going to be okay there. So when we talk about millennials, and we talk about what is a millennial, and this non-millennial has to find his mouse here. Here we go. The typical definition of a millennial is going to be somebody who was born between 1982 and 1996, which puts them roughly 22 to 37. And I've had some 37-year-olds vehemently argue with me that they are not, to not get looped into that category. There's another group. Well, let's talk about millennials for a little bit. If you were in that time frame, you would have seen technology. You've been surrounded by technology, especially in pop culture. By the time you were old enough to have a cell phone or could pay for a cell phone yourself, you had one. There was probably, by the time you got into school, late elementary school, middle school, there were computers in the house, things like that. That was kind of part of where you were. There's another group that they kind of call the Zennials. And the Zennials, if you remember Fresh Prince, Jurassic Park, things like that, you were probably maybe a Zennial, which was being born between 77 and 83. And you were the one that probably had a, the analog childhood. but then your teen and getting into your early adulthood would be digital. For example, you might have never used a computer until your first job, and then you may have had one of the first computers there. So investigating the millennial mind is kind of a catchy topic, but when we're talking about the technology immersion and the persistent technology, I think the greatest impact that we're going to see with the things we talk about today is going to be that group of 10 to 25-year-olds, okay? And as you see here, probably always had a computer at home. You may have been raised with an iPad. We'll talk about the iPad generation. But I think the greatest concerns and the greatest impact may be that group. Now, there's a lot of people here that I see probably fall into that group, but then there's also a lot of people that probably have children or grandchildren, or this is going to be a group of people that you work with and you've been trying to figure it out. So hopefully by the end of this, and we can even maybe get a show of hands at some point as to who actually is a millennial, but maybe we'll have a little bit more sympathy for them when we look at the world that they grew up in. So the first thing we're going to look at, and this is a chart that we're going to come back to and revisit several times, but this is kind of a timeline of sort of some important technology activities that have transpired over the last, say, 35 years. And you'll see I've got a couple of things in red that might be technology milestones, and we're going to talk about those, but we're going to start, down here in the bottom corner. We'll say 1983, about the first cell phone. Now that means that if you were around in 1983, you probably didn't have a cell phone. And in fact, they called them car phones or bag phones, and they were really expensive. But that's the point at which that technology started getting into the mainstream consumer arena. But when I look at where we are now with technology, a very, very important milestone for me is the movie War Games. Now, how many people here remember the movie War Games? And if you're at Dragon Con, you remember the movie War Games, right? But just in case, let's see if we can do this. We're gonna take a look.
David Lightman was a master at computer games, a fast thinker.
Oh, David! Maybe you could tell us who first suggested the idea of reproduction without sex.
Your wife?
Get out, Lightman.
And a promising student at an old game
Hi.
with an electronic twist.
Are those your grades?
Yeah. I don't think that I deserved an F. Do you?
You can go to jail for that.
Only if you're over 18.
This computer company is coming out with these amazing new games in a couple of months.
But I want to play those games.
Wow.
What?
We got something.
He found the right code word to play the game,
We're in.
but it was the wrong computer.
Shall we play a game?
How can I ask you that?
How about mobile, thermo, nuclear, war?
Fine.
All right.
What the hell? They're trajectory headings for multiple impact re-entry vehicles.
How's that mean?
I don't know, but it's great.
All stations, this is Crystal Palace.
I wonder if I should use my subs.
22 Typhoon-class submarines departing Petropavlovsk.
What in the hell's happening here?
Oh my god.
Shall we play?
I have 7, correction 8. That's 8 Redbirds. Get on the sack. Get on and flush the bombers.
Russians are still denying everything, sir.
Who are you working with?
Nobody.
I don't have to believe you.
Overday, we have Soviet missile warning.
Case under arrest pending indictment for espionage.
Espionage?
Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high.
Overday, is this an exercise?
Negative, this is not an exercise.
Be the president on the horn.
It's still playing the game. It's gonna start a war.
Close up the mouth.
Is this a game or is it real?
War Games, playing soon at a theater near you.
Right?
Shall we
Right?
play?
I mean, you can't be here and this not like just get you viscerally. I tell you, the funny thing though for me is there we go, is as a kid when I look at this, looking back on the fact that there was a time where Matthew Broderick, when you were a kid, he was like the coolest dude ever. And like now as an adult, you look back at Ferris Bueller's Day Off and War Games and you're like, he was just a little ass. He was just a really crappy little kid. So war games. Why was war games so important? It was a good snapshot of our whole, Red Scare, duck and cover kind of mentality. But what war games did was, by its success, it was the first movie who really introduced us to this high school kid as hacker, the concept of hacking the Pentagon, hacking into other places. It introduced the concept of actually having a computer in your home. And it was very impactful in that if you look at War Games, the movie, in 1983, and those kids being in, say, middle school or early high school, by a decade later, those are the ones who were designing the computers. Those are the ones late 80s and 90s building the computers. That's where that inspiration came from. I started an IT company in 93. I was in, middle school, freshman in high school during the War Games era. What other impact did War Games have? Well, in October 21st of 1986, there was a law passed. It was called the Stored Communications Act. It was actually the first law to address the hacking in the computer era and this whole high school kid as hacker mentality and concern. So, they passed a law within 3 years of this movie coming out to make a lot of the things that you see in the movie illegal. Very, very impactfully cultural, and we'll kind of come back to seeing that, but that kind of jump-started that everybody can use a computer. AOL, 1991. It's funny how there are people out there who still had their AOL email addresses, and you may have had to put up with a little bit of snickering and scoffing at your AOL email address, but I'm telling you, they're kind of hip again, and now it's kind of cool to have an AOL email address if you've had it the whole time. So, all right, so another couple milestones. Let's look at Windows 95, and I'm sure you guys are going to remember this. This one's quick. Good old Windows 95. And one of the things that I think about like that, Derek, is remember when you'd have the LAN parties and you'd try to fit all the CRTs on one table and you'd have to kind of Tetris them so that you could fit them in there. But so what did Windows 95 do for us? Well, Windows 95 in 1995, that time, was where, first of all, it was one of the computers that was available pretty much in any computer store. The operating system was preloaded, so you could just take it home and set it on the table. The computer started becoming the focal point of the house. It's kind of where maybe what we'd eventually see where your TV in your living room, but your computer in your den or your office, that started being the focal point of the house. That started being the entertainment hub. Again, back in 1995, not so much yet, but that's sort of where we started seeing that transition to. And again, when we talk about people growing up, that's the point at which there was always a computer in the house after that, whether they used it or their parents used it and things like that. So first MP3 player, the Diamond Rio, first MP3 player almost got sued out of existence. Google, who wouldn't be a player, we'd see that in 1998, they wouldn't be a player for a while, but it's just kind of funny to think that Google's been around that long, 20 years of collecting our information. So when we talk about, which is a whole nother topic, right? But another of my really important milestones, how many people here remember Napster? Yeah. Okay,
Countdown
we're going to watch a few minutes of this.
Transfer of data is complete.
Initiating shutdown sequence.
Sean Fanning couldn't bear the thought of another week of class. It was January of 1999, and he was stuck in the car with his cousin, heading back to Northeastern University in Boston after spending the long weekend at home. But instead of attending lectures, he wanted to be back in his room, working on a software project he'd started the previous semester. As the car pulled up to the dorm, he made a split-second decision. He wasn't going back. School would have to wait. He had work to do.
When I was 18 years old, and I hadn't really experienced much at the time, even though it made sense intellectually that it would be widely interesting, it was really hard to fathom the idea of it growing at the level that it did.
For 6 months, Fanning slaved over a computer, and on June 1st, 1999, he unleashed his creation upon the world.
Files accessed.
A free software program that allowed people to share music over the internet. It didn't take long for the service to max out the capacity of his Pentium 100 Linux server. That program was Napster. Little did anyone know at the time, the launch of Napster marked the beginning of a digital revolution. Hank Berry's firm was one of the first to recognize Sean Fanning.
A lot of people don't know this, but the first version of Napster was pretty primitive, but it was the first software program that Sean Fanning ever wrote. Every piece of code.
Over the next 2 years, more than 90 million people downloaded Fanning's creation. At its height, before the service was effectively shut down in July 2001, more than 250 million songs would be downloaded in an average weekend. This caused an instant headache for the music industry.
Hey, 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 here I go now, here I go into new days.
The music industry was not amused. They weren't getting paid for any of those file transfers. Big-name acts like Metallica and Dr. Dre said Napster amounted to little more than thievery. The recording industry called Napster a giant online pirate bazaar, saying it contributes to copyright infringement. In December of 1999, the Recording Industry Association of America sued Napster and demanded a permanent injunction to stop it from operating. Kerry Sherman became president of the RIAA in 2001. He was in-house counsel and oversaw legal strategy for the RIAA at the time of the Napster lawsuit.
At that point, the industry was in a position of trying to play catch-up because all of the music was available illegally in one place in a very widely disseminated software platform.
A legal battle ensued. In the end, Napster was overwhelmed and forced into bankruptcy. At the center of the legal chaos, of course, the young Sean Fanning.
You know, I was always hopeful that it would inspire other technologies and or that it would evolve into something, that would last and survive and continue to provide access to the breadth of selection that it did at its peak. But, it was something where I was just really grateful to be involved in it.
Although Napster was only in operation for a little over 2 years, it had a profound effect on the technology community. Everything from internet service providers to consumer electronics companies. Broadband adoption exploded as consumers jumped on the downloading bandwagon.
Broadband penetration in the United States more than doubled in the period that Napster was operating. In fact, Rupert Murdoch once said, without Napster, there is no internet.
But perhaps no company benefited from Napster and the rise of music downloading more so than Apple Inc.
Without Napster, there is no iPod, period.
In 2003, Apple unveiled the iTunes Music Store, where you...
And we'll stop there with Napster because I can watch it later. So one of the funny things about watching this clip about Napster was me talking to some friends of mine recently saying that there was no way I could adequately convey to my 14-year-old daughter that my generation didn't fight and win the music download wars for me to have to go spend the day on a Sunday going to thrift shops looking for old CDs and record albums. No, we won. We won the download wars. You don't have to do that. You have every song on your phone ever. But so why was Napster so important? Well, obviously, the idea of broadband adoption is kind of cool, and guilty as charged. Hey, you need more bandwidth because it would take you all weekend to download that song. So apart from, yes, what did Napster allow you to do? Okay, it allowed you to download music. It started changing people's mindsets about music distribution and stuff like that. But I think there was a couple of other very profound mental shifts that came out of Napster. The first was a revaluation or a change in perception as to the value of content, okay? And so if a song could be gotten for free and transmitted for free, then it might change what your opinion of the value of that digital media is. And if you change the value of the digital media to free, what you've also done is you've made the Beatles' White Album, in essence, have the same value as an indie band's release, okay? And so what's happening is a democratization of music maybe happens, but also a leveling the playing field for content, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the indie band isn't good, but maybe what we're doing with Napster is we're sowing the seeds of everything else is equal, or everything starts out equal, and there's not a discerning between, hey, this is a classic album from the Beatles that sold 100 million copies versus this is just something that was uploaded yesterday. We'll come back to that. What else did Napster allow you to do? What was one of the beauties of Napster? It allowed you to download just one song. It started making the album irrelevant. And how many times do we used to complain about having to pay $15 for a CD and there only be 2 good songs on there, right? Well, Napster started allowing you to pick and choose and assemble your content in a way that was easier than the mixtapes we would make in the 80s. You could do it very quickly. And it took a while for that seed to grow, but the idea that we could start controlling our own media, our own content, assemble it how we want to, and absorb it how we want to. So we'll see where that comes out. Now, the next thing I have on here is GPS not degraded in 2000. And without getting too nerdy, even though that's my job, basically the government invented GPS as a military thing. But in 2000, they decided to start or stop degrading the GPS signal so that handheld GPS devices and car GPS devices would be more accurate. What has that got to do with, adoption of technology and stuff? Well, everybody remembers having your little flip phones. Everybody remembers when we first started texting with flip phones and what a nightmare that was, and why a lot of people clung to their BlackBerries a lot longer than they should have because the BlackBerries had keyboards. But still got one. There you go. There you go. But the first kind of killer app to make you buy a new, better phone was when they put a camera in it. So they put a camera in the phone, okay? And then that required a little bit more storage, maybe a slightly bigger screen. But actually, the first sort of new app to make you push the development of phones was GPS, because when you put GPS in a phone, all of a sudden you have to have a stronger battery, you have to have a better processor, you have to have a bigger screen. Oh, well, you know what, if we're going to have a bigger screen, let's have internet access then. And it kind of goes from there. So GPS becoming available to the consumers around 2005 actually is what started pushing the growth of the smartphones. We see YouTube on here 2005. Again, it would take a while to take root. But the big deal in 2006, so Facebook comes along, a social media platform. Of course, originally Facebook was just for students and academicians and stuff, and then it came out to everybody. And of course, I could probably do a whole long session on the perils of Facebook, but we'll skip that. But I think this next little clip is just kind of cute to show the evolution of Facebook, even during a very small period of time, and how what Facebook started out looking like. Is it going to play here? There we go. so that was just kind of a quick little clip just to kind of show you how Facebook evolved. And of course, it's evolved even more from there. But during that period of time, the biggest change in how Facebook delivered information to everybody was that, I guess you could classify it as tailoring the experience to you. You know, when you go to a website and they want to put a cookie in your browser, and it's because we want to, deliver content that's relevant to you, tailor it to you. And what you saw during that period of time of Facebook's evolution was the realization that the more they tailored the content to you, the more you could control your feed, control the access to the information that you wanted, the more you could personalize it, the more engaged you would become. And of course, that's what they want, the amount of engagement, the amount of time you spend using it. Again, things that we saw, starting with Napster, coming forward to Facebook and how Facebook personalizes it. And we're going to kind of get to the thesis sentence, but here's another little walk down memory lane. We'll just look at a couple seconds of this. Where were you when this happened?
And smartphones now. Everybody uses a laptop and or a smartphone. And the question has arisen lately, is there room for a third category of device in the middle? Something that's between a laptop and a smartphone. And of course, we've pondered this question for years as well. The bar is pretty high. In order to really create a new category of devices, those devices are going to have to be far better at doing some key tasks. They're going to have to be far better at doing some really important things. Better than the laptop, better than the smartphone. What kind of tasks? Well, things like browsing the web. That's a pretty tall order. Something that's better at browsing the web than a laptop? Okay. Doing email. Enjoying and sharing photographs. Video. Watching videos. Enjoying your music collection. Playing games. Reading ebooks. If there's going to be a third category of device, it's going to have to be better at these kinds of tasks than a laptop or a smartphone. Otherwise, it has no reason for being. Now, some people have thought that's a netbook. The problem is, netbooks aren't better at anything. They're slow, they have low quality displays, and they run funky old PC software. So they're not better than a laptop at anything, they're just cheaper. They're just cheap laptops. And we don't think that they're a third category device. But we think we've got something that is. And we'd like to show it to you today for the first time. And we call it the iPad.
And we could again spend so much time when you get on YouTube and you go down a rabbit hole of watching a lot of these old product launch videos and see where we've come from there. But why was the iPad so important? Well, first of all, because if we're going to call them the iPad generation, I think we have to acknowledge the significance of the release of the iPad, the app-centric nature of it, that the iPad was kind of where it opened the door for specific apps for different things. Again, that's a concept we'll come back to. But more importantly, I mean, most of us in here, I see a lot of us in here, were probably the ones whose parents parked you in front of Sesame Street and let Sesame Street babysit you. And I think some of the younger people in the room may have been ones that were babysat by iPads and raised by iPads. And it would frustrate your parents because you could figure out the iPad faster and better than they could. Or perhaps I see some people in here that might have been the Barney generation. And I remember that Barney used to get a lot of grief. People used to pick on Barney, and I remember a friend of mine's wife saying one time, "Don't pick on Barney. Barney is the 30 minutes a day I get alone to myself when Barney is on." But the iPad. So again, going up through our timeline, we see Twitter with 100 million users. Finally, we see full motion VR, Oculus VR. Again, that's a very important technology. And finally, Fortnite. Well, why is Fortnite on here? Why is Fortnite up here at the opposite end of the spectrum from where we started at War Games? And I think Fortnite helps to represent probably the highest evolution of where we've come with our engagement with technology. And for the few people in the room who might not be familiar with it, it's a very fast twitch, instant gratification game. A lot of times you can play very quick rounds, 100 people in an arena and everybody tries to kill each other and whoever's left wins. But the games can be very, very fast. So it's a lot of positive feedback. It's very quick. It's very fast twitch. It's very instant on, very intense. And I think that that's a really good example of where we are now with our use of technology. And you see these kids who are so good at Fortnite and like the mouse in the lab hitting the little lever. So, and in fact, for those of you who aren't, I have just a couple seconds of a clip. We'll just watch the first couple seconds of this. Just kind of see how far we've come.
If you're out there, we need your help. The storm came, the monsters followed. They took everything. Our towns, our families. The few of us left are in serious danger. Now, it's time to fight back. All we need is a leader. And that's you.
And again, we can spend all day watching those videos. So one more look at this chart here. So again, I want everybody to kind of look at our timeline, look at how we've kind of started out small, started out with certain bits of technology, the computer in the living room, how we've gotten all the way up to the iPad and the phone that you carry around with you, the fast twitch stuff. So let's look at that, and now let's tie it all together. And here's where we get to kind of the science and the interesting parts of it. So this is actually a cartoon I also like. It's called The Teenage Brain. And the field of research that we're going to talk about is actually referred to as the teenage brain and the teenage brain research. And I just like this cartoon because anybody here who's raising a teenager or a young adult, you may appreciate this is the areas of the brain used or dedicated to different subjects. So like, for example, love is the big chunk in the front. And I think love is a very diplomatic way to say what that part of the brain is dedicated to thinking about. But you probably can't see it, but there's a little tiny a point on the bottom that says that says like memory for chores and homework and stuff like that. But there was a groundbreaking book called Mind Change by a lady named Susan Greenfield. And in her book, she says the human brain adapts to the environment, and the environment is changing in an unprecedented way. So the brain may also be changing in an unprecedented way. And she was one of the first ones to start looking at how the involvement, engagement with this technology, and how, as Ian Malcolm said, we were so caught up in whether we could do something, we didn't know whether we should. We create technology. We create technology designed to integrate with your life in every aspect of your life. We don't take a step back and think about what that does to us and how that changes us. And a good way to look at how that changes it, let's go back, is the idea of digital natives versus digital immigrants. Now, a good chunk of the people in the room are going to be what we consider digital immigrants. You came to digital world. You had to learn how to use your first cell phone. Maybe you didn't have a computer until you got to work or later. So technology was something that you had to learn how to use, learn how to embrace, perhaps even change your own mindset and activity to meet that, as opposed to a digital native. And when we talk about our target group in millennials, we talk about them being, digital natives, born into it, like Bain, I was born and molded by it, But if you look at some of the things on the list and you can kind of figure out where you are with technology and how you use things, digital natives, receiving information quickly from multiple sources, multitasking, parallel processing, doing their homework while listening to Spotify or Pandora and chatting with one of their friends and playing a game. Picture, sound, and video before text. We're living in the YouTube age where people prefer to get their information from a YouTube video, and most people would rather watch a 2-minute YouTube video on how to do something than read a web page about it. Hyperlink sources. You want to be able to start, we're so used now to you start with a subject And as you get into that subject, you're allowed to jump to other areas. My daughter, she might be doing research on Egyptian pyramids, and next thing I know, she's reading about the heat shielding on the space shuttles because, there's some connection that she's managed to get from point A to point B. Interacting in real time, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, Instant Stream, things like that. User-generated content. And here's when we start going back to looking at Napster and how Napster kind of leveled the playing field. I think the whole everybody can create content, everybody can share content, content is there to be shared, has put us in this position of where everybody can have a YouTube channel. Everybody can present information. At the same time, have we lost some of the, and controls isn't quite the right word, but the ability to discern the value of that information based on where it came from. The example that I use is I have a friend who, whenever he had a decision to make or needed information, he would basically poll his friends, maybe ask 10 people what they thought about, that strange lump on the side of his head. And if 5 people said it was nothing, or 6 people said it was nothing, and 4 people said he needed to have it checked out, it was 6-4, and that's all that mattered. Whereas maybe 4 of those people were actually doctors, 2 of which were neurosurgeons. And so what happens is there tends to be kind of if it's 51% versus 49% in the information, all the sources of information are equally valid. I'm not saying they're not, just saying that that's an important perceptual difference. When you look at us and people who function as kind of a digital immigrant, perhaps you prefer, I want that report. I want a printed report on my desk. I remember a friend of mine who was an attorney who talked about one of the paralegals at the firm, and when she asked her for some research on a case, she emailed her some links. And she's like, no, I want you to print out with references and citations and make sure you've double checked them. So as again, look at this chart, kind of see where you see, and there's some intermingling. There's some hybrids. We're hybrids, But when you see the kind of extreme cases, you can kind of see where you fit in on this. All right. So again, what does this mean? Well, I told you that this talk, the basis for this talk is me talking to investigators on how to understand how the brains work differently and the impact of that. Well, one of the big impacts is that people today who embrace computers, especially young people and millennials, it's all about the apps. So much of what you do is app-centric. You have an app that brings you food. You have an app that takes you places. You have an app that you buy all your stuff from. And when I'm working with especially traditional older investigators, they'll interview somebody, they'll look for sources of information, and maybe the sources of information that are important to them is, well, we'll pull their phone records, we'll look at their bank records. Well, the phone records and bank records now aren't really going to tell you a lot about what a millennial or a digital native is doing, right? And I've seen people who come to us and they say, well, we've subpoenaed the bank records and all we see is, Amazon, Venmo, PayPal, Google Wallet. That doesn't tell us anything, Or the phone records. Well, we've looked at their phone records. They're not really communicating with anybody suspicious. Or real life situations where, okay, well, yeah, we've been monitoring our suspect. We've staked our suspect out. They really don't come and go much. They just spend all their time at their house. They don't really make much phone calls. There's not much activity on their bank account. Meanwhile, they're like, an international terrorist who's, connecting through video games and stuff like that, because that's where their information flow and stuff is. So again, separate conversation, but this is the stuff we talk about with the investigators, especially when we talk about financial crimes. And when we talk about how millennials and the younger generation interact with data, we talk about, like we said, you have to look at these other sources of information. This is kind of interesting. When I first started giving this talk, or versions of this talk about 5-6 years ago, everybody was worried about the acronyms, and everybody was cautioning parents that you had to read their kids' chats and you had to know what the acronyms were about and stuff like that. Well, acronyms are important, and it was always kind of funny too that with acronyms and stuff, everything is pretty much slang for sex, isn't it? sex or drugs. The joke that we use in our office is real life conversation. Two people are chatting back and forth. One of them says, "Do you want some beer and pizza?" And the other person's like, "Man, yeah, beer and pizza would be great." They said, "Well, how much beer and pizza do you want?" And he said, "Well, how about a nickel bag of beer and a gram of pizza?" So, real life example. But it's kind of funny that the acronyms and stuff that used to be so important kind of went by the wayside. Well, why have the acronyms gone by the wayside? Well, because you don't have to type a button 3 times to get a letter anymore. The acronyms were really good about speeding up speech, which is really funny because so now more of trying to understand, investigate, get inside the mind of the younger generation has to do with slang. And the interesting thing from our work when we're conducting investigations is seeing how much a person's communication pattern now, how much the younger generation is what we would call technically multilingual, in that they may use a variety of different communication platforms to communicate with different peer groups, and you will see differences in the style of communication, the tone of communication, the slang, across not only racial, socioeconomic, but, I guess an oversimplification is, the band group, they all talk one way, the jocks talk another. Again, an oversimplification, but you see what I'm saying is that different communication styles to where you could look at somebody's electronic device and swear it was 2 or 3 different people. I think most of the parents of young people today would swear they were 2 or 3 people as well. But here's where it gets kind of funny. So, of course, nowadays it's all about keeping up with the slang. And you can kind of see how many of these you recognize. Hopefully you will tell your bae that my talk was lit and you're now woke. But of course, nothing is worse than a guy in his 50s trying to use young people slang. So I know that was awkward for everybody. But it's okay. You're a little shook on that now, I see. I am throwing shade on myself, exactly. But so you see that you can't take the language at face value either. So it's very important that you stay up on that. So what does this all mean? And so here's kind of what maybe is the aha point of this. And that is that growing up with technology, growing up being immersed in technology, being immersed in 24/7, always on technology, well, what does that do to you? What does that do to a person? Well, one of the things that they say and the research shows is that it changes, first of all, your perception of time and distance. Well, that makes sense. It's funny how technology has made the world a smaller place, but a larger place at the same time. I remember reading a quote a long time ago that said that if we had today Star Trek type teleporters, okay, and we could travel anywhere in the world instantly, that it would do so much to break down, cultural differences, racism, things like that, when you could actually see and interact with the people in different cultures and different lands and stuff like that at the same time. Well, we have that now. Again, I talk about my 14-year-old daughter who's able to communicate instantly with anybody on the planet, can go anywhere between, Google Earth and Street View and Facebook Live and all these kind of things. You can go to all these different places. So the world becomes smaller, but it also becomes larger because you have the ability to experience so much more of it. And that connection to the world is very important for what we'll see here now. It changes your default state, okay? And if there's one takeaway from this whole talk, we've built up to this point right here, and that is, for most of us, 20, 30 years ago, our default state was disconnected. We walked around the world not connected. Okay? It didn't mean you were lonely, it didn't mean you were alone, it just meant you didn't have an active connection, all right? You got a letter from somebody, that was really cool. There's a connection. You get a phone call from somebody, that's really cool. There's a connection. But your default state is disconnected, all right? Kids today, and a lot of us now, our default state is an always-on connection, all right? And I appreciate that a lot of people haven't taken their cell phones out while we're here, but as soon as you walk out in the hall, it's going to be the first thing you do. You're going to check your cell phone, see if there's messages. I know there's a lot of parents here who, as long as your cell phone is in your pocket, you know your kids are okay. Was it Sarah Silverman had said one time that if the phone rings after 10 o'clock, she just assumes her parents are dead? You know, having that connection, you know everything's okay because your phone's not ringing, right? That you feel. Take that for young people today and multiply it by 100. That is the connection that they have with technology. And what that means is that, you know, let's say you have a child who uses technology inappropriately, okay, and you want to take steps to address that. Well, one of the things that you might do is take their cell phone away. Well, how many parents have had a situation where you take your cell phone away from your teenager and they flip the freak out? And you don't understand the proportionality of it's just your cell phone, you know? And what I'm here to tell you is you haven't taken their cell phone away. What you've done is you've severed their connection to the world and you've impacted their sense of identity, okay? And I know that sounds crazy, but that's the way it is. One of the parents in one of the talks I gave said, how is that any different than just putting them on restriction for the weekend? And I said, exactly. You don't get it. It's way different, okay? We have programmed, you know, and technology and our use of technology and where we started from the war games all the way up through Windows 95, we've programmed these children and ourselves to have this constant feedback loop, notifications, upvotes, comments, likes, all those are drugs. And those are that constant feeling of feedback, that buzzing of your phone in your pocket. I mean, I'm just as guilty. I travel for work. And when I go to different places, you know, I'll be in Texas and oh my gosh, I just had the best brisket ever. Here's a picture of the brisket that I just had. And my friends will be going, oh my gosh, that's a great brisket. And you know, you get all those good feelings because I just shared the greatest brisket in the world with them. Again, multiply that by 100 with this interconnectivity to the point where I actually gave this talk in July, and the day before I went out to give the talk, the World Health Organization had finally recognized video game addiction as an actual medical condition so that you could start kind of understanding how to treat that. There's a lot of technology addiction programs now who recognize that if you have somebody who is addicted to their technology or children who are too immersed in their technology, you can't just cut them off from it. You have to do some type of methadone type of step down program. You have to, you know, think of ways to remove it in a measured way because of their connection to it. And so that's the takeaway. Realize that when you're dealing with even ourselves or young people, the connection with technology, because how we've kind of lobster potted them. You know, you put the lobster in the cold water and you slowly raise the temperature. They don't realize they're boring. We are in a constant feedback loop world. And if it was just about the feedback, it would be okay. But here's the second big kind of oops point, and I want to run through this real quick. There's a lab in Stanford, Palo Alto, California. It's called the Persuasive Technology Labs, founded in 1998 by Dr. B.J. Fogg. What they do is they develop games, apps, and digital machines designed to change the way people think. Stop me if you heard this one, okay? We're talking about creating AI in the form of apps and games and news feeds and things like that, you know, it was bad enough when they were trying to sell you something. You know, Candy Crush. Candy Crush was instantly addictive. You had to check back in. How many people had the game where you had to water your plant every day, or your Fitbit where you have to check in every day to get the achievements and rewards? So what we do is we have these apps and this technology that creates this addictive cycle, okay? And it's bad enough if that's just for financial purposes. But what they're talking about, and here's the second part of that slide, is that they're developing the AI and the technology, and they've been doing it for almost 20 years, to automatically change the way you think, the way you perceive things, the way you approach the world, the way you get addicted to the products, for the purpose of not only selling you something, but possibly for the purpose of changing the way you vote, or the way you look at your neighbor, or the way you view people of another culture, another country. This is a real scientific thing. So what ties us all together is that, you know, I would like to think that some of us digital immigrants still have some of our abilities to discern in these things and know when they're happening to us. But as we get sucked more into the digital native type of embracing of technology, it becomes less and less. So, and again, there's so much on this subject, but as we're winding down, take a picture of this slide. If what I've talked about today, and this is just maybe a trailer for the body of science out there, there's actually, they do CAT scans and MRIs and show how the brains of the younger generation who interact daily with technology are actually wired differently. These books are available. They're really good. The most awkward thing to say in a talk like this is that if you don't have time to read about how technology is taking over our lives, these are available as audiobooks on Amazon. A couple of, again, strategies and good practices are kind of my thesis sentence here as we talked about. And again, what we've talked about today and what I've tried to show you is only the tip of the iceberg. Hopefully you guys will do your own research. But when I'm talking to investigators, one golden rule, every crime nowadays is a computer crime. If somebody knocks over a liquor store, that's a computer crime. There's maybe DVR camera data. There's text messages about it. There's GPS tracking location, cell tower data to show where they went. I do a lot of work with trucks, transfer trucks, semi-trailers. They get in wrecks. The driver was on the cell phone, on Facebook, whatever. Every crime can be a computer crime. Think outside the traditional evidence stream. When you're trying to understand what the younger generation is doing or the millennials are doing, just remember that so much of the information is app driven. It's not phone records and financial stuff. Don't expect typical or rational behavior. This will make a lot of you chuckle, but I work with a lot of really old school investigators, and they're the ones who take the person, set them down at the table, just like on TV, and start asking them the questions. And they'll think you're guilty because you fidgeted. You didn't look me in the eye. You couldn't give me a straight narrative. One of the biggest complaints we hear from investigators is, I'm interviewing you about, some type of crime. And they tell you, well, you either start from the end, like let's start from today and I want you to work backwards and tell me everything that happened. If that doesn't work, okay, well, let's start from the beginning and you tell me that. And actually, if you make people work backwards in their story, it's harder for them to lie, because most of the times when people figure out they're going to have an alibi or something, they remember their story from start to beginning. It's like making people say the alphabet backwards. But the point is that you interview a millennial, and I blame Lost for this, but they'll tell stories with flashbacks and flash forwards. Well, then this happened, but now 3 hours later we went and did this, but then before we did that. And of course, there's this perception of a lack of validity to their story, but it's just how they process, how they remember, and how they tell the story. Flash forwards, flashback. Remember how digital natives perceive information. So you may not be an investigator, but maybe you work with younger generations, or you work with older generations, and understanding how we process information. If you're trying to interview somebody who's committed a crime, or work with somebody in your office, and you keep giving them paper reports, or you keep giving them charts and graphs, and they're not getting it, maybe they need a YouTube video. You know what I'm saying? Maybe you need to show them the video of the event. Don't make them read a narrative. I'm to the point now, I have to read a lot of court testimony and a lot of depositions and stuff. I'd kind of rather sit and watch a video deposition, plus you get more body language and stuff. But the point is that you can interview your child, or you can interview a millennial in an investigation, and the things that they were taught for years about the cues, the touching your face, the not looking you in the eye, the fidgeting, the sitting sideways, the leaning forward, the leaning back, that might not apply. Why? Because the majority of their communication is not that 90-10 like we always talk about in the old days. It's 90% of how you look and 10% of what you say. So when you're talking to somebody, you're used to looking at these visual clues and stuff like that. In our digital communication world, we don't have that. And I know a lot of people understand the problems of trying to communicate via text, where sarcasm or tone might get lost in the message. Well, you have to realize that a face-to-face communication now may not be their primary source of communication. So you can't rely on those same old cues, because, kids, my daughter, she'll be sitting in the cafeteria and her friend is at the next table, and they'll text each other instead of just turning and looking and talking to each other. We talk about looking at the context of data as opposed to just the parts. Looking at the big picture. If you're only looking at one source of somebody's data, their call records, maybe their iChat and not their WhatsApp. You're only getting a small part of the picture. Ramifications of isolating from technology. Just remember, for all of us, there is a stress level associated with using technology. I would tell everybody this. I would challenge you, next time you go to the grocery store and you're going to be in there for an hour, leave your phone in your car. Now, some people are going to be like, well, my shopping list is on my phone. Okay, well then, pick something else. But see what it feels like to leave your phone for an hour. It does get easier. The things where they say, okay, we have a box on the table and everybody puts their phones in there so we can have family time at dinner. It's tough at first. Does get a little easier. But try it so that you can understand, especially if you're dealing with your kids or your grandkids or some of your coworkers, that you can understand that angst as well. With investigators, we talk about the laws of unintended consequences. Sometimes when you're conducting investigations with younger suspects, witnesses, or victims, there can be, you interview a kid in high school about them witnessing something, and next thing you know, they're in trouble with the high school just because they're witnessing it. But data leaks or corruption. I think we're all aware of the fact that it's almost impossible for anything to happen now without it being on social media. A real-life example with some of the U.S. attorneys I work with is that they will interview a young person in a federal case, and they will say, okay, now you can't talk to anybody about this. And they're like, cool. And then they check in at the federal courthouse on Facebook. It's that kind of thing. And then part of that, though, also leads to the telephone game. And there's a really good article, if you can see the URL at the bottom, where it says, how the telephone game has ripped the fabric of our society apart. The fact that so much information gets passed from one person to the next, there's a normal corruption of information when that happens, but in today's age, there are actually intentional corruptions of data. And sometimes when we go back to that level of the playing field of information that we talked about, you don't always have the ability to discern when information has been corrupted or not. When somebody's purposefully changing the information because, hey, everybody's viewpoint is valid. Not necessarily. It may be valid, but you need to understand the concept of placing weight to it, and weigh it based on those person's motivations or particular skills or stuff like that. So, thoughts to take away, right? Is Apple to blame for the opioid crisis? Now, we do a lot of work with people who have passed away with the opioid crisis and trying to get in their devices. But let's take a look at that. If we spent the last 20 years creating apps and technology to create an addictive mindset, right, and a always need to have this kind of feedback mindset, that's kind of what the opioid crisis is. Always chasing that high, always having to get that next achievement. Whatever you did today is not good enough. Tomorrow's got to be better. Are we to blame for this because we've spent the last 20 years creating addicted kids ready to be addictive? Digital natives in the incel movement. We've taught that it's okay to live a life completely inside computers, but then we raise people who can only live their life inside computers, then they get upset when real life people won't interact with them. A critical mass of short attention spans. We talked about Fortnite and how fast twitch that is. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here with always having notifications, always having, how does it spiral out of control? Are we going to turn into the people from Wall-E and we just sit there with all of our screens and our milkshakes? And then schools are embracing technology, which is a good thing and something that I believe is very important. I like classes to have computers. I like classes to have whiteboards. But shouldn't we always encourage there to be non-technology classes? Hours of the day where they do traditional instruction to teach them that there can be another way about it. So I know I haven't left much time for questions. I'm supposed to tell you guys that I'll be outside here to answer questions. But please, if you're interested in this subject, You can find us online, Ellington Digital Forensics. You can also find us on Facebook because I'll post articles about this. But please check it out. It's very important. Try some of the experiments that I talked about, leaving your phone and judging your own anxiety level so that you can kind of be more compassionate and understanding when the young people that you work with and your coworkers are in the same boat. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.